Columbus discovering the New World is a very problematic term, as many of you know. It is loaded with implied racism and white supremacy, the idea that Columbus, followed by other Europeans, arrived in the Americas in the Western Hemisphere and encountered a wilderness sparsely populated by a group of people, indigenous Americans, who were not very civilized. This is not even how they saw it at the time. This is not how a lot of Europeans saw it at the time. This is the story that develops, in many cases, after basically a genocide. And one of the main reasons for that is to justify that genocide, right? They weren't using the land. They were savages. They weren't civilized. There wasn't a lot here. The development of the modern world and of modern industrial society and the greatness of America is sort of on the backs of this genocide, whether we like it or not. Whether America, the United States, is at fault for that or not, because it didn't even exist when Columbus got here. That's essentially a reality that you can't escape. To justify that, a lot of folks play into this or pander to this, the New World, Columbus discovering America, discovering the New World. Because it was new when Europeans showed up. Even though people were here, it didn't count until Europeans were here. That idea. That's not how it's used in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is called A New World because it really brings together Europeans with the indigenous people already here and a massive amount of back and forth across the Atlantic of trade and of people moving, and also people from Africa, almost all of whom arrive as slaves in the Americas. So there's a massive amount of goods and people transported across the Atlantic. And in North and South America, that creates whole new ethnic groups, right? The mixture of European and indigenous populations, and then African genealogy behind that. So there's a whole new, slew of groups of people essentially being created. That's what it means by a new world in a nutshell, right? But it's very problematic to call it the New World. That's why it's called A New World in our book. But to literally say this is a new world is problematic because there were people here that had been here for thousands of years, right? And they had very developed civilizations in many cases. Some were more nomadic. They followed a certain, like the bison, the American bison or buffalo, were followed by the Lakota Sioux, other groups. And so they had to move around and follow that population. And so they did not have like huge developed population centers or cities, but places where they had agriculture, like the Aztec civilization, where you grow food from the ground, you're able to stay in the same place and you're able to develop large cities. And Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, had a population of 250,000 people. It's the largest city in the Americas. It's as large or larger than any city in Europe at the time. And it's pretty much as large or bigger than most cities in the world at the time, other than places in China and in India. So yeah. Also, it's also problematic to call it the New World for when Columbus gets here, because people arrived before him. The Norse or Vikings in the 10th century colonized Greenland, and then over the next almost 600 years, up until a few generations before Columbus sails, you're talking about 5 centuries of colonization that went as far south as Newfoundland or New Brunswick in Canada. So Europeans came to the Americas before Columbus. They captured more than likely indigenous people and brought them back to the Americas. So the indigenous people visited Europe. Brought them back to Europe. The indigenous people visited Europe before Columbus made it to the Americas. Not just as captives of the Vikings, but in 1476, 2 people on a longboat, it was described as a longboat or canoe, arrived in Ireland, and they were described as being from Cathay, Cathay, which is essentially China. That's what they called China at the time. China, or as Donald Trump would say, China. But because, Columbus actually met these people and they were described as being from China. It's hard for me to say that without laughing now. Sorry, because of Donald Trump. But that's because they did not know the Americas were in between Europe and Asia. Or you cross the Atlantic and you don't just get to Asia, you hit the Western Hemisphere. So they assumed they were from Asia. So there were actually indigenous people who sailed on their own vessels across the Atlantic and made it to Europe before Columbus did. And he actually met these people. And it's one of the reasons he knew it was possible to do that, to sail across the Atlantic and land somewhere and, make that journey. So, of course, Columbus thought he was in Asia the whole time when he made it to this country, or made it to the Americas. He never made it to the present day U.S. He landed in present day the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and eventually colonized islands in the West Indies or Caribbean. On his fourth voyage, he made it to Brazil, but never actually lands. It's not until 30 years later when Cortez actually lands in Mexico and encounters the Aztec civilization. So this is not something that happens overnight, right? Where Europeans show up and an indigenous population disappears. But it does, once there are many explorers that come here and many expeditions and there's people colonizing and there's a lot of interaction with indigenous folks here, the viruses they bring and the germs they bring start spreading and kill a lot of people. And then the warfare and sort of the brutality that a lot of Europeans, the way in which a lot of Europeans conducted themselves here and the brutality towards indigenous people also is responsible for a huge population decline, the largest demographic disaster in human history, where the Americas, North and South America, went from, about 90 million people to just a few million. In the United States, it was maybe as many as 5 million. Some put it over 10 million in the present day U.S., indigenous people, right? The Algonquin-speaking tribes, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Lakota Sioux, the Miwok, the Ohlone, Ottawa, right? Delaware, all of these groups, right? The Seminole, the Apache, the Comanche, the Hopi people, right? There were maybe anywhere from 2 to 5 million. That's the number used in our textbook. Some people put it above 10 million people when Columbus got to the Americas. And by 1900, by the 20th century, there are 250,000 people. Massive population decline, right? Now there are about 3 million people. So there are more indigenous people now than there were 100 years ago. And their percentage of the whole overall population might be slightly larger, but still a massive decline, right? Where it used to be all indigenous people, and there were a few million of them, and now there are still a few million of them, but they're surrounded by hundreds of millions of other people, which and then for better or worse, however you want to take that. So Columbus, one of the reasons that Columbus's journey ushers in a new period in history, the modern era, modern capitalism, a lot of people argue, and creates this new world that we still live in and deal with every day. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just Columbus himself. Columbus gets a lot of flack, catches a lot of flack, as he should, for a lot of the brutality and ushering in basically a genocide against a whole hemisphere of people. But he was an ambitious person. It did take a lot of ambition and guts, for lack of a better term, to make the journey he did. Even though actually he wasn't the first person on his crew to sight land, he claimed he was, so that he could get like a reward for that or a commission for that from the Isabella of Spain. So he actually lied and screwed over his crew for that. He's kind of a jerk. Cortez was kind of a sleazebag in the same way, but there is a certain level of ambition and adventure that I don't think is completely false. But there are a lot of other things that had to happen for Columbus's journey to take place, to be funded, and then for his specific voyages to be the hallmark, or seen as the hallmark of the European colonization of the Americas. Like, why is it Columbus came here, even though the Vikings had been here? And why is it this guy that's cited as the person that discovered America, or what, which is not true, but why is he seen as this pivotal moment? A lot of things happen because of the spread of Islam in the Ottoman Empire, in Turkey, present-day Turkey, and then in the Middle East, and then the Moors in North Africa. Particularly in present-day Turkey, you have what used to be access through the Middle East to Asia, the Silk Road, right, from the Roman Empire, that Europeans would use to trade with Asia for goods that they wanted. And that's essentially cut off. So there's a desire to find an alternate route to Asia. And if you're in Europe, if you're a European, if you can't go east through the Middle East, through parts of Russia, the Middle East, you have to go across the Atlantic, either across the Atlantic around the globe to Asia, which Columbus does, or you go around Africa, around the southern tip of Africa, which a lot of other people do, including Portuguese explorers, who start trading on the coast of West Africa. And this is where the slave trade starts. So you have the slave trade, you have the colonization of the Americas. So you have all of these different groups, indigenous people in the Americas, Africans, Europeans, being put into contact with each other. And it creates a lot of, it's extremely volatile. And it's extremely traumatic for a lot of groups involved, particularly the indigenous people and most definitely for people from Africa who are enslaved. Gutenberg, actually, the printing press is important for this because unlike the Vikings, unlike other folks who, other migrations into the Americas, at any point in human history, when Columbus does it and he comes back, the printing press allows for essentially the mass production of text, of books, so that people who explored here, like Columbus or Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a priest who was on Columbus's second voyage, they can write about what they saw in America. They can draw maps. They can do all that stuff, and it's reproduced for everybody. And the printing press is really seen as a democratization of knowledge and a big part of the era of science and like the Enlightenment in Europe, right? And the replacement of Latin as the official language in a lot of Europe, where only a few people knew how to speak it, with national languages like French or Spanish or Italian. And so the fact that Columbus was able to travel, come back, and talk about what he saw, and people could study that. More people could study that than ever before, and the access to those texts was greater than ever before, allowed for a massive race to explore, right? And the consolidation of a lot of the European countries under monarchy, like France and Spain and England, right? These countries that we see today as like a nation state were more splintered or occupied by foreign powers, by Spain with the Moors or whatever, essentially for the first time since the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire in the West, and then the Byzantine Empire, you had European powers sort of unifying under one government, one dynastic regime, and were able to fund and support and encourage colonization in order to gain territory, to gain wealth, and to spread Christianity, right? But Columbus thinks he died thinking that he actually made it to Asia, right? That's why he calls the people he encounters Indians. They were not Indians. They were the Taino, Taino, the Taino. They lived in various islands throughout the Caribbean. But that's why we have some confusing terms, right? He calls them Indians, and which is a term that went out of favor for a while. In our textbook, it's used sort of historically. It's used as a term, for the most part, I think, at least in the United States, Native Americans or Indians would prefer to be called by their specific group, Cherokee or, Seminole or Comanche.